Good morning. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Mackenzie Eaglen, resident fellow here at AEI, looking at defense budgets and strategies. It's a pleasure this morning to welcome all of our audience virtually, but the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee here at AEI's headquarters in DuPont Circle. He has a busy morning with votes, so we're going to be a little flexible on timing, but welcome to AEI again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I am so pleased to see you. We did this about a year and a half ago. It was a lot of fun. We had a good conversation. You're very candid and forthright, which we really welcome and appreciate. I know because this is not your first rodeo at AEI, I'll be very brief in my intro. We all know the chairman quite well. It's his 13th term of Congress, his third year having the gavel. So he's now a veteran chairman, and he's learned a lot, I think, in those 3 years about shepherding the Defense Authorization Bill to final passage each year. And we welcome him to AEI this morning. He's been on a speaking series at different locations around Washington. And this morning, we're really going to focus on the FY22 defense budget and, of course, the year ahead. And I guess we should first start with the lack of a budget, Mr. Chairman, because you and I were on a panel last week together, and you were very colorful in saying that you cannot finish your work on time if you don't get the budget. And again, this morning, we were speaking before we came in here that you feel perhaps the White House lacks urgency in getting you that data. So can you give us the latest update and what you're thinking about how to move this bill this year?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I think this is an incredibly interesting time in national security and national defense policy. Obviously, with the Biden administration coming in, you always have a changeover when you have a new president. But here we have a president with 40 years of experience who's been very focused on foreign policy, and a team, from Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, all these people, they've been working on this for a long time. They have very definitive ideas about where we need to go. And I think we're at a number of inflection points in terms of national security policy and in terms of defense policy. And I'm really excited about the possibilities in national security policy, in our bill, and also in the broader policy decisions as we sort of reconnect in terms of focusing on partnerships and allies, as we really look at how we're spending money at the Pentagon, as we look at adapting to new technology and the new warfare that we've seen develop. How do we pivot to be ready for that? And there's a lot of very exciting things going on, and that gives us a great opportunity to make positive change, to my mind. We also have a very strong bipartisan team. Mike Rogers, who's my ranking member, he and I are very close on many, many issues. I think we've got a real opportunity to do some positive things. We've got Jack Reed and Jim Inhofe, who I've been working with now for 4 years. So I think we've got a positive opportunity. But yeah, to start that opportunity, we need the budget. And I think there's a couple of things that aren't quite, well, it has not been made clear to me that folks understand this. If we don't get the budget by a certain time frame, we can't mark up the appropriations bills and the defense bill. So, and if we slip past the middle of May, my staff tells me, we will not be able to do any of those things before August. And I don't know, maybe we cancel the August recess and spend August doing appropriations bills. I'd be surprised. So we're into September, post-Labor Day. So we got 3 weeks before October 1. CRs are not a good thing. Right. Now, I know from a White House perspective, well, we don't need to pass the budget till October 1st. So what's the rush? There are a couple things that happen between when you submit it to us and when we send it back to you. A lot of things. We need some time. And the only other thing, and I would try to be respectful and not hurt anyone's feelings, but the White House the budget doesn't have to be perfect. Yeah. Okay? Right. In the history of Congress, I don't think we've ever had a situation where Congress has simply taken the president's budget and said, oh, we're good. Passed it and sent it along. In fact, you remember they used to vote on Bill Clinton's budget when the Republicans would try to embarrass him. And I don't think it ever got a single vote. All right? We will make changes. So if there's something in there that you don't like, that isn't exactly the way you want it, there is time to fix it. There is not time to get through the legislative process if we don't get this thing before May 10th. And, that's all I can say. Okay, fair enough. So let's assume you get it roughly in time to just squeak by and get your bill done just in time, which I understand is a burden on you. Can you walk us through, and I appreciate you talking about the bipartisan dynamic for leadership of both chambers. Can you walk us through your personal priorities for this year? I know we talked last time about what you had learned getting the bill out of committee versus getting it passed on the floor.
in the House. So what are your priorities and what are the pitfalls, I guess, that you see ahead, assuming, let's just assume for a moment, everything's sort of moving roughly in time for final passage before the fiscal year?
Well, I think that the four biggest priorities for me are, in no particular order. First of all, we had our fun F-35 discussion over the course of the last few weeks. Getting better at purchasing equipment, both large and small, and in particular, software and technology are keys. Because you think of the big programs like the F-35, the Littoral Combat Ship, the tanker, the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, all these things that wound up either being canceled or costing more money than we would have hoped. They have a lot more in common with smaller programs like the Jitters radio, occurred to me, in that the real problem is we don't make the software upgradable enough quickly enough. And we get into, last week for the first time I heard the phrase vendor lock. I think it's been out there for a while, but the idea the vendor's got you, okay? Got the contract now, I own the software, and what I want to do is I want to change the incentives so that we start getting our money's worth, okay? I think it's really important, and the way I always explain this, and I know how important the F-35 is. I do. And for all those people out there trying to educate me on it, I have been to the classified briefings. I know what the Chinese have as well as anybody. I know all of that. But at $38,000 an hour to fly with an availability rate sub 50% in an engine that is apparently going to become very difficult to fix past about 2030 so that even fewer of our planes are available, I think we can do better, okay? I think we can get it below that number. However, if you are either Lockheed or any one of their subs that is getting paid this money, and I come to you and I say, look, we got a problem. I'm paying you $38,000 an hour. I would rather pay you $25,000 an hour. Can you please help me with that? They're going to go, well, let me think about it. Yeah, I don't understand the question, okay? Yeah. I would rather, why wouldn't I rather have $38,000 than $25,000? If we don't have some incentive in place to push them to make that change, that hurts defense, okay? And a staffer reminded me of the B-2 bomber situation where we had a similar problem in terms of maintenance costs. And, we couldn't get it fixed. And then finally, I don't know if this was a bluff or if it was just a genuine assessment by the Department of Defense. They said, you know what, let's just get rid of the plane. We'll mothball it, we'll move on to something else. And then all of a sudden the contractor was like, well, now that I think about it, I think maybe we can bring those costs down a little bit. Why don't we talk? All right? That's all I'm talking about, is getting those. So that is huge in what we need to do. Second thing is, along the same lines, warfare is changing. It is about information as much as it is about large platforms. The best, most sophisticated platform in the world can be shut down like that if you can't get the information from where it comes to who needs to use it. We need to have more robust command and control systems. We need to have more diffuse information systems so that really shift the focus to that. And one story that's really stuck out with me recently is, the ability of swarms of very small, cheap drones to deliver lethal firepower. Swarms of these, I don't know what they cost. They cost next to nothing. Let's just put it that way. You can sit in that can deliver more firepower than an F-35 that can't get into the zone because of the surface-to-air missiles that are guarding it. Stealth, sadly, does not mean that it's Wonder Woman's airplane and it's invisible. You can still kind of see it if you got the right missiles and the right radar and the right infrared. Right. So we'll have a situation where maybe we've got $100 billion worth of airplanes that can't get in after our adversaries, but they can kick the crap out of us with $75,000 worth of drones. I'd like to avoid that. So those two, there's a huge personnel thing that is very important that I'll get into in more detail because I've gone on too long. And the other thing I want to mention is, in terms of the challenge, the biggest challenge is, this is the conversation right here about how to give us the best possible national defense. I also have a long thing about how our national defense strategy is overly ambitious,
yes,
and therefore making it very difficult for us to actually accomplish anything, because it just envisions a world that is impossible. So we're constantly chasing our tail and unable to do what it says we're supposed to do. That needs to get more realistic. But right now, the biggest challenge to all of this is, for all of what I've said there, the public fight is, well, how much are you spending? The top line's not high enough. It's got to be 3 to 5%. It's got to be 3 to 5%. And then I've got the people on the left saying, you know, we're wasting all this money on defense. You got to cut it by 20%. All I want is, let's talk about what we're spending the money on. What are the capabilities? Right now, the fight is, you know, if you like defense spending, well, it's got to be higher. If you don't like defense spending, well, it's got to be lower. All right?
Yep.
I think if we keep a flat, roughly, defense budget, and let me just be kind to the Biden administration, since they may not like the fact that I said they ought to send us the budget, I think the number they picked is absolutely right. Very well thought out. They've got a great plan, a great strategy. And if we in Congress waste an enormous amount of time fighting over whether or not we ought to add a few more dollars or cut a few more dollars, we're really missing the boat. That's the money. Let's go figure out how we can spend it in the best, most cost-effective way possible. And I think there are a lot of things we can do in that regard.
Fair enough. That's a lot to unpack.
Yes.
Thank you. And I appreciate it. You know, the point of the vendor lock, you know, particularly capital assets, right? And where sustainment is the majority cost of the weapon system over its lifetime, as you're pointing out. And that's a challenge with the incentive structure. On the other side, you had mentioned particularly software. But the current PPB, the planning and programming process inside the building, and the authorization and appropriations process, it's not designed for, I would argue, big, ambitious software programs, right? So I mean more than a pilot, right? So something like the Air Force's battle management system. It's going to span multiple programs, possibly eventually even multiple services, right? So are you and your counterparts, and I know I'm always asking about the appropriators, but you know they're a huge part of this conversation.
Absolutely.
I feel like there are times where Congress is stomping their foot that there's a problem, but they're also a roadblock. How do we get? I mean, because you're right, you have to change, but that also requires some change on Capitol Hill. How are we going to win these technology races like AI and better command and control when it's not going to be one single program element, line item number, or program of record?
Yeah, I mean, several. I mean, first of all, as you well know, the deep dive that Bob Work and Eric Schmidt did on AI is a really instructive thing, not just in terms of what we need to do to get better at AI, and also how important AI is going to be to the future of national security, but also more broadly, how to better purchase technology and how to better implement technology. So I recommend that to everyone to take a look at, and here's what we need to learn in terms of how we move forward on it. But the impediments are clear, and I'm perfectly honest with you, I have no idea if we can overcome said impediments. But I think we should at least identify them and understand the depth of the problem. You know, in descending order, you've got, or ascending order, you've got the Pentagon. The culture at the Pentagon needs a lot of work. In the first place, you know, they don't encourage individual decisions, they encourage process. Process takes time. Individual decisions can be made more quickly. You can more quickly understand, okay, I know how the system, that's what we need. Well, if you got to go up 10 levels of command before you can make that decision, by the time you get up there, software has changed and you need something else. I could go on, but the culture of the Pentagon needs to be changed. I will just say that I have never in my 24 years been in a situation where there seemed like more hope, more urgency to make those changes. You see what the Marine Corps is doing under Commandant Berger, re-envisioning how they're going to do that. You see the blank slate reviews that Secretary Esper started, even what Ash Carter and Bob Work started when they were there. There was a really I had breakfast a couple days ago with the new Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Brown, and you know, he gets it, and they're really beginning to make, so you got that. Then of course you got the contractors. What I've already said about consultants, and normally I say this about political consultants, is there is one thing that all political consultants are really good at, and that is getting you to pay them. Okay, they're really good at that. You have to find the ones that are good at that and also good at actually delivering services. And there are quite a few. But, I mean, look, figuring out how to get paid is part of how you succeed. And contractors are really good at figuring out how to get paid. And we're going to fight that battle. And I've already gone through some of the ways we're going to do that. It's important. And then the third thing is the one that I think is perhaps the most difficult to overcome. And that would be, well, me and the members of Congress. Past a certain point, this is actually not that complicated a job. You represent roughly 700,000 people. Your job is to make them happy, okay? Your job is to represent them. Now, I think the job's a little bit more complicated, and there are other things we're trying to accomplish in terms of preserving representative democracy and making the country work. But at the end of the day, I'm the voice of the people in the 9th District of the state of Washington, and I need to listen to what they want. And similar to defense contractors, if they've got 1,000 jobs in the district because of a defense contract, and you come along and say, well, I've got this new way of looking at defense that's going to make those 1,000 jobs go away, that's a problem. And typically, a lot of the programs, the Pentagon may get there, we may be able to get there, and then you come up against the member of Congress who says, well, wait a second, what program are we talking? Oh, there's 250 jobs in my district. We're not getting rid of that. Now, how do we overcome that? I think your district wants you to spend their money wisely, not just spend it in their district.
Great.
And when I first got elected to Congress, one of the decisions was whether or not to build another 20 B-2 bombers. A huge chunk of it was made in the northern end of my district. I looked at it. I didn't think it was a good investment. I voted against it.
Wow.
Eventually, Norm Dix forgave me, and we're actually pretty good friends.
Wow,
But my constituents actually appreciated it. I think there is more value in making those right decisions than your average member of Congress understands. I think there is a shift in that opinion. I don't think it's as old school as it used to be, where you simply try to bring home the bacon every day. But it's tough, So those are going to be some of the impediments to making the changes we need to make.
Well, I am excited about your hopefulness. I feel that energy. My AEI colleagues are working also behind the scenes. They're sensing that even from appropriators, which I feel like is lightning in a bottle to want to try and, even on Capitol Hill, do things.
Let me just say in defense of appropriators, by the way, I don't think this is peculiar to them. I mean, they're the ones who are in the seats that actually have to make the decisions, okay? And that makes it more difficult, and they're the ones that are more visible. But I think perhaps appropriators understand these challenges better than it's the average member of Congress who's maybe not on the Appropriations Committee or not on the Defense Committee, who's just got the thing in their district that's going up and saying, So I think appropriators have a firm understanding of this, and I'm hopeful that we're trying to get to the same place.
I'm actually really excited to hear that. That makes me optimistic then, if you're thinking it. So you mentioned you had breakfast with General Brown, and you mentioned the Commandant as well. And of course, they've been writing together and thinking together, and they're two men in a hurry for big ideas, big change, big vision. And a common theme that I pick up is obviously redefining readiness, getting approval from you and your colleagues to actually retire significant fleets and inventories of capital assets. Not necessarily to free up money for modernization, because it doesn't always work that way, as you know, but just to be able to do different things with their money that they are given. Thinking of modernization differently. It's not just the here and now and what's available and can be purchased, but just over the horizon, the medium term. And risk, right? Sharing better balance and share of risk among stakeholders, of which, of course, you are one. Combatant commanders would be another group. To your points earlier, the Central Command commander was testifying before your committee earlier this week, and he talked about that small drone swarm threat. So small UAS, I should say, not that it's a small threat. He actually said he was pretty worried about it.
Exactly. The things are small, the threat is large.
Threat is large, and it sounded like that's one that's keeping him up at night. So I guess my question is, are you finding receptiveness to those ideas, right? That readiness isn't just what's available. And no, the combatant commanders, that maybe there does need to be a demand signal diet to think about the health of the force over the 5-year planning horizon that the department operates under. Is there receptivity to what those chiefs are thinking about and telling you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, and I again, in the 24 plus years I've been in Congress, I think the talent level in Congress has actually gotten a lot higher. The diversity of backgrounds. On my committee alone, we have people who have served in certainly we have a lot of veterans, people who served in the military, but we have people who've served in the State Department, people who served in the CIA, people who have run successful tech businesses. And that diversity of experience has really made it receptive to this type of thinking. Now you've got the impediments that I mentioned that are there, but I think you have people who are adapting to the world around them, to a more competitive, technologically based, rapidly changing world. I think you see that the members of Congress, and the sad thing is, the members of Congress that get the most attention are the ones that, shout the loudest, okay? America, that is not reflective of the body. I know you're a little worried about that, and I understand that. There is just a ton of talent in Congress right now that's trying to figure out questions like this and trying to get to the right answer. And a lot of it is in some of the newer members. And some of the most successful things we did is I really tried to empower the newer members on our committee to sort of balance out the influence, because those of us on the top row have strengths, but so does everyone down through there. And the formation of these task forces that we've done, the Future of Defense Task Force that Seth Moulton and Jim Banks led last year, and then Alyssa Slotkin and Mike Gallagher are working on the supply chain. A lot of good stuff coming out of that. So yeah, I think there is an understanding that what people like Brown and Berger are talking about over in the Pentagon, we're excited about it. We want to make this work. It's not easy. It's complicated, but I think there is quite a bit of support for that.
So it sounds like you have a framework for perhaps, the chairman's mark. You have the future of, cherry picking the best ideas in the Future of Defense Task Force, the Gallagher-Slotkin work on supply chains, the future of AI.
So,
right? So you have these three, deep dives, and I think a lot of good ideas of where to go. Do you expect those three will inform this year's NDAA?
Absolutely, yeah.
Good, wonderful. So if we could just, it's as you mentioned, spending the money that you have, that the department has, helping them spend their money better, using it smarter and more wisely, focusing on capabilities, check. I think the department is still, I think they're trying to shift. You mentioned culture, I think, but for the most part, it's still a threat-based budget process primarily. Capabilities are important, but there's also, some lingering questions that have to get answered by civilian policymakers, right? Like, if we need duplicity and redundancy, say, in long-range fires, and is that affordable? That's something I think that the secretary himself has to answer. And right now, that's unclear. So, but I want to just talk about the threat list for a moment. Don't want to get too much into it because you've already spoken so much about this. But I guess I really want to understand your thinking about, more realistic defense strategy.
Sure.
Sort of reining in the ambitious nature of it, which I actually, I think that's a fair point. Although I interpreted, let's just focus on just China briefly for one moment, and I promise this will be my only question on this subject. I think that the 2018 document was an admission that we can't dominate everywhere, particularly in simultaneous conflicts. It's a deterrence by denial approach. So tell me.
I think it was an admission to it, but then as you read through it, it was like, we admit it, but yeah, we'd still like you to build all this stuff so that we could.
Right.
It was an admission, but it wasn't a transition into an actual policy that recognized the true implications of that admission, I would say. But go ahead. Sorry.
So I guess I want to understand your thinking. I think you have received some briefings, or one in particular that stood out to you. Can you tell me, I mean, we don't want anything classified, of course, but can you just give me a sense of what you learned and why that's shaped your thinking so much?
Yeah, not entirely, except to say that, it's deterrence, not dominance, is what I'm really kind of looking at us being able to do here.
Right.
And I guess I'll answer the question differently if I could.
Sure.
What I'm sort of looking at is, what exactly is it that we want to stop China and Russia from doing?
Yes.
And then have that, be the focus. And certainly, if you're in a position to tell another country that here are our red lines and we're so big and so bad that if you do it, we will crush you in the blink of an eye, that's a good position to be in. It doesn't always work out because, there's a problem. But But there are other ways to deter adversaries from doing. You have to figure what are their interests. How do we make sure that it's not in China's interest to invade Taiwan? Well, I mean, China's number one interest is in trying to figure out some way to feed and take care of 1.4 billion people. So that's there are economic incentives. Plus, if their entire neighborhood is mad at them, that creates a problem. So we can build. There are other ways to do it than just having enough F-35s and enough aircraft carriers so that we can overwhelm them. Okay, so that's point one. Point two, which is more to your thing, is what really struck me was, well, it really comes back to the swarm of drones versus the F-35. It's not so much that, well, it's very difficult to dominate in this world. Very difficult.
I agree.
Okay, because, just speaking as an incumbent politician, 20 years ago when I first got into this, how many competitive races were there each year in Congress? 35, maybe, Now, everybody, the barriers to entry, way low, which by the way, I think is good for democracy. It's a good thing, all right? But you can't just be so big and bad that no one's gonna take you on because they can take you on with a tiny little drone, okay? So it's more acknowledging the reality of it. And actually, I used this analogy at the Reagan Defense Forum. I apologize. I don't think they own the IP on this one, so I can go ahead and say it. It's like when the University of Connecticut Huskies, every year, well, who's going to win the women's basketball championship? I think it's going to be Connecticut. And I think they're going to win the championship by, 20. They dominated, all right? And that's cool. Now they don't. Now there's more competition. That's the world we are living in. So what that means is you have to be more clever about how you win. You have to be able to use cheaper, less obvious things to achieve your objectives. And that's part of this transition. What really struck me about that thing was we can't dominate because of how competitive. Look at what Russia's been able to do. The cyber capability and the disinformation campaigns on the cheap. Okay, right. That's what really struck me. Was in the world we live in today, no one person's going to dominate because the barriers to entry are so low. So you've got to be a lot more nimble, a lot smarter, and a lot more diversified in how you achieve your national security objectives.
So the Commandant has spoken about, back again to the concept of sort of these, being on the wrong end of the cost imposition strategy with the drone swarming, right? So you talked about the price of a fighter jet program versus what a swarm could potentially cost and do great damage. Previous secretaries of the Air Force have also sort of talked about that we need more attritable, expendable, cheap weapons, right? So kind of like how when you go to the picnic, you take your plastic silverware and you're just going to pitch it at the end. And that's I guess you could take it home and wash it, but most of the time you're going to pitch
Isn't this like Earth Day or something?
It is Earth Day.
I don't think that's the best analogy for this particular day, but
they use.
Appreciate the sentiment, yes.
Is Congress really okay with expendable, cheap weapons?
If it works. But that's sort of the question you've got to get into is what works and how do you get there and to be flexible and all of that. And I think that the position we're in, as I was thinking about it, is as sort of we used to be the dominant power, and history is replete with stories of the empires falling. I think of when Microsoft and Apple rose up against IBM. And so why does that happen? Part of the reason it happens is because the incumbent power likes the rules as they are. These are the rules and under those rules, we win. That's cool, okay? And so they kind of become obsessed with the idea that these must be the rules. Okay, you can't do that. That's not fair, The way you avoid that is you pivot. Okay, if the rules have changed, and again, back in the campaign structure, I hadn't run a difficult campaign in years and years and years. When 2018 came up, and gosh, the world had changed.
I remember.
And everyone's kind of freaking out. It's like, well, they're going to be on social media. They're going to do this. And my simple was, okay, we can do what they do. Okay, anything they're doing, there isn't any reason why we can't figure it out. All right, so let's figure it out. Let's not be trapped in the way we used to do things. Well, it's a new world. Okay. I've got reasonably intelligent people around me. I'm paying some of those consultants I mentioned earlier. We can figure this out. And similarly, if some small power is going to come at us with a swarm of small drones, or if Russia is going to start trying to disrupt through cyberspace, no reason on God's green earth that we can't figure out how to compete in that world. We're the United States of America, for crying out loud. We got the largest economy in the world. We got the best universities. We got a heck of a lot of smart people. We got the best military in the world. Let's figure it out. Where you get in trouble is when you're like, no, I don't want to figure it out. I'm dominating this world over here. You can't take this world away from me. I like this world. Let's keep this. No. You cannot have that world, okay?
Yeah.
This is the world. You can compete in it. It's going to be a little bit different. That's why I like to have fun with it, okay? It's entertaining. If everything was the same every day and you won every day, that would be boring. My wife totally disagrees with me at this point, by the way. She'd be perfectly happy if nobody ever ran against me and I just was automatically reelected every year. I honestly wouldn't. You got to keep thinking. You got to compete. You got to update. You got to figure out what's going on. And the companies that do that, large or small, are the ones that succeed. And the countries that do that, large or small, are the ones that succeed. And I want to be one of those countries.
So it's interesting, you said the P word, pivot, and it got me thinking about, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, the last pivot to Asia, and the Obama administration, and not much has changed in our posture and presence in the Indo-Pacific area of operations really since the pivot. We have an additional littoral combat ship in Singapore, and I wouldn't say that's too overly threatening. So I guess, are you also trying to think, when you talk about spending the money better, are you thinking about posture and presence and wanting to support the department, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative? It's led by Congress, resisted by the department. Now the department, I think, is getting there, is more on board. But for now, that's sort of like the equivalent of an unfunded priority list, right? And you also have those. So
we did fund it a little bit, not as much as some people wanted.
You did, but it's a 5-year plan, right? I believe, and there's lots of other additional priorities in there. So how are you thinking about how you're going to make those trade-offs in the committee if the department doesn't make them? The unfunded lists, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, and any force posture and presence changes.
Yeah, actually, this is a good example of sort of the broader issue that I'm talking about. When you talk about, the pivot to Asia, we said we were going to pivot, nothing really happened, our presence hasn't changed that much. A whole lot did happen, okay? Because in focusing on Asia, military force presence is not the only issue or even the most important issue in terms of what it means to pivot to Asia. What we have done, Ash Carter started this, first of all, India. We have really tried to strengthen our relationship with India, and in particular, our mill-to-mill relationship. We had the whole Quad thing that just came out with, Japan, Australia, India, and us. We are re-engaging in these relationships in a whole series of countries. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam. We've really strengthened our relationships there. We've had an ongoing relationship with Thailand that we're building up. So I think the pivot has happened. Now, and this part of my disagreement with some on the left who want to see dramatic cuts to the defense budget is, they continue to argue, why does America have 800 bases or whatever it is we supposedly, why are we all over the place? We're not fighting in Korea anymore, we're not fighting, Japan, we're not, presence does matter. Presence is part of how we build relationships, how we build partner capacity so that it's not just us. Those bases, those interactions that we have, whether it's a small special forces team, like, 15 guys in a small country in Africa building relationships, or whether it's, 28,000, folks in military members in South Korea, that presence helps, but it's not it. That's not the only thing you do in order to reemphasize a region. The partnerships, the alliances, the diplomacy, the development projects, and we're doing that. And I think we have, tried to shore up in the last, how many ever years it's been since since President Obama put out the pivot idea. I think we are doing that.
Okay, fair. Great.
And so did President Trump, by the way. Well, sorry, President Trump's people did. He kept trying to pull them all out of everywhere, but they just sort of said, okay. And they sort of built on that and kept going forward with it.
Speaking of the former president, Trump, that is, and this came up again a lot before your committee this week about, the pullout from Afghanistan. It's going to include contractors, which I think, Iraq was done a little differently. There was a lingering presence with contractors after we have so many intelligence and diplomatic personnel on the ground, and it sounds like the last administration had sort of set the boundaries for the ability to negotiate for this White House, or what they felt was their ability. So the Central Command commander talked about, basically, we're going to continue to conduct robust counterterror operations, but not from inside Afghanistan. And basically saying if we had to fly 9 hours from Al Udeid or Al Dhafra, that's what we're going to do. But as you know, that's
tougher.
That's tough.
Yeah.
So how do you assure your constituents if they are worried about the threat of terrorism and the U.S. pullout, say?
Well, a couple things about that. First of all, I would never be so bold as to assure my constituents that nothing bad will happen. Never would do that in a million years. And I think that's actually something, part of the struggle we have is, as we've learned in COVID, we manage risk poorly as a society.
I agree.
And in part, that's because we're used to not having as much risk as human beings used to have. We don't seem to acknowledge that, but in America, we've built a relatively safe society in terms of disease and all manner of different other things. So we get used to having less risk, and we want to eliminate it at that point. It doesn't work that way. You got to make choices in terms of how do you manage that risk. So what we need to do in this case is look at the terrorism risk and say, okay, the reason we were in Afghanistan was because we did not want transnational terrorist groups to be able to strike against us in the homeland, most dramatically, but also against our interests elsewhere. So do we need to spend $15 billion a year and have 10,000 troops and 15,000 contractors in Afghanistan in order to mitigate that risk? And when you ask the question that way, no. Are you kidding me? We've got this amount of money. We've got ISIS and Al-Qaeda and a variety of different offshoots in Somalia and Libya and Syria, other places in the Middle East, throughout Africa. We've got all these groups everywhere, and we're spending $15 billion a year, 25,000 personnel in Afghanistan to try to manage that risk. Not a smart investment, okay, in terms of managing the broader transnational terrorism threat. So, and right now, what any expert will tell you, where is the threat most likely to come from? It's most likely to come from Africa and the Middle East. 100%, not Afghanistan. So, yeah, we will not be as able to hit threats on a day in and day out basis in Afghanistan with a new posture. But if the threats rise up, there are options, and we will continue to work to build. We don't have other options in the region right now, but part of the reason we don't have other options in the region right now is that we don't need them. We're spending $15 billion in Afghanistan. Why would we go up to Kazakhstan and say, hey, we need a base? We don't, okay? So we're gonna look at other options in that regard and do it in a more cost-effective way than the current presence. It's also worth noting that the Taliban and ISIS hate each other, and they are fighting each other, all right? And so they're going to have problems in there that are totally different than it was in the mid-90s when Osama bin Laden showed up and said, hey, can I stay here? It was, much more symbiotic relationship. So I think my analysis, the risk of a transnational terrorist threat coming out of Afghanistan after we leave is relatively low and can be much better maintained in a more cost-effective manner than the current force posture that we have.
I regret at the beginning I forgot to note the hashtag. I believe if you're on Twitter, it's hashtag Chairman Smith at AEI. If you want to submit questions for the chairman, and then also via email, of course, online. Really quickly, I want to just talk about, you've referenced that figure, and last week you talked about 14 billion. It's 14 to 15 billion you said about our costs of operating.
And by the way, that's the cheapest year we've had in a long time. That was the FY21 money.
There's this notion taking hold in Washington, like rapid fire, that there's going to be a windfall of savings, and because of the drawdown, what we found in Iraq in particular was that it's so unpredictable, and actually it's not the number of forces, it's the location of the country that matters more. And so, for example, we could haul everything out from trucks out of Iraq and into Kuwait, whereas in this case, everything's basically going to move by ship or airplane, and of course you got to get it to the ship first. So it's just a different scenario. It's more complicated and expensive in some ways than Iraq.
In the short term, sure.
In the short term, sure. So I guess, are you banking on this kind of savings? I mean, the OCO budget was just a placeholder anyway, of $20 billion.
I'm not banking on it. The OCO is not a placeholder.
I meant the 22 number.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
what I meant.
Yeah, no, I'm not. In the short term, I'm not banking on the savings in the sense that, I don't know. It's like I have a $10,000 vacation plan. Oh, I'm not going. Now I clearly have $10,000 in my bank account and I could go do something else.
Right.
But it is logical to assume that if we don't have that specific $15 billion expense on a year in and year out basis, then that is going to give us greater flexibility, certainly over a 5-year period. Not in the first 6 months we still got a little ways to go. We can still spend some of that $14 billion from FY21 as we're pulling them out of there. But, not in a dollar for dollar sense, but absolutely, because if in FY22, if come October 1, we're not in Afghanistan anymore, that is going to save some amount of money.
Now, the challenge here, of course, is that there was so much base budget priorities in OCO. Is it not just going to get absorbed and consumed when it comes over?
Well, not all of it. No, yes. No, I mean, look, by the way, the $14 billion figure for FY21 is not the OCO figure. Off the top of my head, I forget what the OCO figure was for them, but it was larger than that.
Yes.
Quite a bit larger than that, actually. The $14 billion is the money we actually did spend in Afghanistan. Yes, the OCO became sort of a slush fund, is such an ugly phrase, but it became a way to spend money on things that weren't necessarily those priorities. But the estimate is, and it's, how much is there? I mean, if you got a brigade that spends, 6 months in Afghanistan, 6 months back home, how much of it was Afghan? Yeah, I mean, it's not simple, but again, I will stand by the notion that we will save money by not being in. How much? We'll figure it out. But it does free us up long term for other options.
I see what you're saying. The total appropriated OCO last year was $69 billion, and of that, I think roughly 21 was marked for Afghanistan, and to your point, specifically, 14 billion was roughly spent. I haven't looked into that myself. So, great. Now I'm getting a bunch of questions on Taiwan and on China again. So even though I said I'd only throw you one, the audience seems to want you to dig a little deeper on if we're prepared to help Taiwan fend off Chinese aggression in the next half decade, which the Indo-Pacific commander, now confirmed by the Senate, has said, and his predecessor, of course, said the same similarly, that this is a now problem. It's not like a 2035 problem. And if how comfortable you are militarily doing that. And then, of course, along those same lines, another question that if you really believe it's unachievable for us to maintain that capability to do it, like what amount of deterrence is sufficient in your mind based on how you're interpreting the Adam Smith defense strategy?
Yeah, I don't know for sure, okay? But what I do know is that we need to start asking the right question. And I guess what I'm saying is that I believe the way we have built our defense strategy around China has been asking the wrong question. And that question is, how can we make sure that we dominate China? That's the question we've been asking, okay? I don't know what the answer to the question of how do we best deter China is. I've got some ideas, as I've mentioned. I think the Indo-Pacific Defense Initiative is a huge part of it. Our relationship with India is a huge part of it. The partnerships and alliances that we build, making sure that Taiwan has a reasonable amount of defense systems, which we have sold them over the years. There's a whole bunch of different things. But at the end of the day, it comes down to a simple equation. How do we build a world in which China does not believe it to be in their interests to attack Taiwan? That's the answer to it. Or that's the question, sorry. Previously, the answer to that question was, we make sure that we can destroy them in an all-out war if necessary. That, I think, is the wrong approach. I think there are a lot of other things that we can do to deter them. And even past a certain point, the ability to win an all-out war with China doesn't necessarily deter them from invading Taiwan, because China may calculate, yes, they could win that war, but are they willing to fight it? And there's no way to answer that question in advance. I mean, you can bluff, but people are going to reach different conclusions on whether or not we're going to do that. Just like there's no way to answer the question right now, would the U.S., go in to defend Taiwan if China attacked? I think we need to send the clear message that we would, and we would work with allies to do that as well, and that we would raise enormous costs against China if they did that. Basically make it clear that the price that they would pay for doing that is overwhelming and not in their best interest. I also think part of deterring them, and I'm really worried that people are starting to say that strategic ambiguity can't last. Why not? Okay? And more importantly, your alternative is, all right? Yeah, I guess it's a little uncomfortable that Taiwan has to live in a situation where they're not truly independent and they're operating under the idea that, look, at some point, yeah, we'll probably be one with China, but let's not sweat the details. Let's just live our lives and run the economy and move forward. It's really important. And I think one of the big ways to deter China is not to push the whole, Taiwan independence thing. If we do that, then you are really poking the bear in a totally unnecessary way. What really worked for the last 15 years, Taiwan and China very intersected, okay? Flights back and forth, the amount of business that's done between those two countries. And you got your grand sort of 30,000 foot, national policy theory and everything. And then you got the businessman in Shanghai who's like, why do I want to invade Taiwan? I'm making a mint, selling back and forth with them, and we're going to blow that all up because of what? All right? Build those ties, create the interests that say, let's just keep things as they are. And I don't think it is overwhelmingly helpful for people to go, oh my God, China's going to invade Taiwan tomorrow. We have to react. And in reacting, we then ramp the tensions up even further and make China feel like, let's just calm down, okay? Things are going quite well right now between Taiwan and China, rhetoric aside, in terms of business relations, in terms of the success of both countries. I mean, my goodness, look at the economy of both China and Taiwan and how successful they've been able to be. Let's try to just keep that where it is and not promote a conflict. I'm really worried about that language getting us into that trouble.
Fair. Speaking of, before I get to a sort of nuts and bolts question from the audience, there does seem to be a more near-term threat with Russia amassing more forces at Ukraine. Is that something you're thinking about, worried about, helping the department think through options or plans, or the White House or anybody? What's on your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is so sad and unfortunate that the breakup of the Soviet Union didn't work out better. And we can walk through that history. But Russia is now determined that the world is a zero-sum game between their power and influence and our power and influence, and they want to try to undermine us by, any way they can so that they can make themselves appear more powerful and stronger. And that's really unfortunate, because there was a world in which we could have both lived together and prospered together. But right now we are facing a threatening Russia that is trying to expand its influence. Do I think that actual Russian troops are going to go pouring into Ukraine? It seems unlikely, but the risk is there. So we have got to work with our partners in Eastern Europe and our partners in the broader NATO to, again, deter Russia from doing that. And help drive up the cost of them doing it. I support, giving Ukraine the lethal weapons we've given them to try to deter Russia from doing that. And there's a whole lot of other diplomatic things we need to do, worrying about Ukraine, what might happen in the Baltics, what might happen in Belarus. So yes, I am very concerned about that. To my mind, that is a more immediate threat than China pouring into Taiwan.
I agree. Let me ask, let's go back to when our initial interview and our closing moments here. And a question was, do you have in mind any short-term options for increasing competition on maintenance contracts, as we talked about being the bulk of the spending on any sort of major weapon system or platform, and you referred to this new awakening on vendor lock. So one of the issues here, of course, is data, right? And the companies are able to collect that data, and then they own it. And therefore, that's why competition is essentially, it becomes this monopoly. It's about the data and the information so they can win the maintenance contracts. So anything that you can do this year or next year, or even the year after,
Absolutely.
to change the incentives?
Yeah, this is actually something that I was wrong about 20 years ago, but live and learn. So
Wait, what were you wrong about?
I'll get to that in a second. So the basic issue is the data, the IP, everything that's involved in that. When you enter into a contract and you're going to develop all those questions, well, who owns it? And I'm actually a big fan of intellectual property. I think it works, and it's all about incentives. Okay, if people have an incentive that says that if you come up with this, you're going to make a lot of money, then they're more likely to come up with it.
Yes.
Okay, you'd give them an IP incentive that's going to work. But there's three basic choices when you enter into these contracts. One, the contractor owns the IP. Two, the contractor shares the IP with the department, and the department actually owns as much of it. I don't know how that works out, but they own a chunk of it. And three would be that the IP is open and available to anybody. Okay. Now, in an ideal world, I'd love to get to three, but that really doesn't work because the company is going to be very reluctant to do all of that if they know their competitors are going to be able to come in and use their IP to then compete against them. So you're probably not going to get there. But I was more focused on, well, we've got to let the company own the IP because then that encourages them. And it was wrong because if DoD owns the IP, then they are in a better position they can, even if they can't bring in another contract, they can at least train our they can compete with it. No, we got it. We're not going to pay you to do it.
Right.
And there are ways then and also the way you build systems, make them more modular, make them more upgradable so that you don't have that vendor lock. So basically, we need to give the incentives. Now, that's good for future contracts. And by the way, the B-21 contract, one of the most positive, encouraging things that I've had happen to me in the last couple of weeks was a brief I got on the B-21. They learned the lessons from the F-35.
That's
and
big
they're
news.
actually on time, on budget. They're making it work in a very intelligent way. So for future contracts, that's what you need to do is as upfront, spend the extra money to own that IP so that you can avoid vendor lock long term. Okay. The more fun question in my mind, and my staff disagrees with me on this, is what about the contracts that you already have? All right.
Yes.
Because in theory, the vendor in this situation's like, yeah, we got the contract, we're good. So what I want to try to get creative about is how do we incentivize some of those companies to change those contracts in a more favorable way?
Okay, so you're thinking. You don't have answers yet, or you're not ready to unveil them.
I've got ideas, but my staff implored me not to speculate in a public forum.
Okay, good. Fair enough. We won't.
And it would be a hell of a lot more fun if I could speculate, by the way, but I promised, so I don't. And I'm very dependent upon my staff. I cannot afford to
I was just going to say, we know
so,
who's the boss. We don't go around the staff. All right, okay, I understand that. So it's interesting that our audience had to tune in till the very end to get what I would argue is headline news and a rare good news story from the chairman of such a consequential committee that there's actually a procurement program going well.
Can I tell you a quick joke about that?
Yes.
So I'm walking into this briefing with a colleague, Derek Kilmer, who's on the Appropriators Committee, good friend, and he said, well, yeah, I'm going to this brief. I said, now when I walk in there, I am certain that they're going to tell me that it's on time, it's under budget, and it's performing better than they expected. Because, that's what always happens when you walk into these briefs. And I, of course, was being a wise ass. But it turned out to be the case.
So they convinced you that it really wasn't a farce?
Not to say that there still aren't things that can go wrong. There always are. But I think it was very educational in terms of lessons learned from it. Because, we've had this terrible 2 decades. Of programs.
Yes, I know.
But it seems like maybe it shouldn't have taken 20 years, or 15, but lessons are being learned, and we're getting better about how we buy these things. So we're starting to see the change that I think we need to see.
Well, my closing moderator privilege here in our conversation, which I thank you again for, is it wasn't just the contract structure and negotiation and all of that. It was the Air Force chief at the time saying, we're not going to screw this up. It was his personal priority. And he said, if anyone wants to make any change to this program, they got to come to the chief. Like somebody out in, middle of the country, program manager, et cetera. And that locked everything down, literally. Not the vendor lock sense of the term, but in terms of we're not going to do things that bolt stuff on, make it the Ferrari that we can't take out of the garage, as the current chief refers to some capabilities. And that was a key part of this, was the senior uniform leadership getting actively involved and working with your two committees, and the Senate included, to keep some things about it classified, which was a big debate at the time with the late Senator McCain. And I'm actually really pleased to hear. We almost never end on a good news story in defense policy, Mr. Chairman, so thank you for that.
And I think those comments about the culture and how people change, and one of the big culture, and this is why I get so obsessed about the budget and the 500-ship Navy and all this other stuff, is you have to be incentivized. And if you think that the money's always going to be there, you don't have as much of an incentive. You know, it's the cliche line that I've used over and over again, gentlemen, we're out of money, now we have to think. Okay, and if you come along, well, we're going to give you 3 to 5% every year, no matter what. You don't have to think as hard, because okay, if this doesn't work out, we still got the money. If you're down to it and you're like, if I don't get this right, it's gone. I've got to get, what I want. What I've said over and over again is, I want the Pentagon to feel some measure of physical pain every time they spend $1, and I want them to just to make sure that they do it in the most cost-effective, intelligent way, because they just want to get the most out of it, not because they know Congress will always come along and just throw them a bunch more money and paper over the problem. Let's make it work in the most cost-effective way possible, and your Air Force example is spot on to how we get there.
Wants the Pentagon to feel pain when they spend money. Mr. Chairman, you have a vote, so I thank you so much for staying almost the full hour and for coming to AEI to talk the nuts and bolts of the budget. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to see you. Appreciate the discussion.
You too.